Good afternoon. Welcome to the CLE program sponsored by the Iowa State Bar Association's Diversity and Inclusiveness Committee. I'm Emily Chafa, co-chair of the Diversity and Inclusiveness Committee, and happy to welcome all of our amazing speakers this afternoon, and happy to moderate this esteemed panel. Without further ado, I'll go ahead and introduce all of our speakers in the order in which you'll hear from them. Max Mowitz is a lifelong advocate for the LGBTQ+ community and the liberation of all marginalized peoples. Since coming out in high school, Max's leadership and activism focuses on community and coalition building, solidarity, and compassionate community education, like Max is providing today. Max is the executive director of One Iowa and One Iowa Action, leading both statewide LGBTQ+ advocacy organizations focused on uplifting and empowering LGBTQ+ Iowans, and provides quite a bit of education to the public. Prior to their leadership of the organization, Max served as the program director for 5 years, building One Iowa's programming, direct service, and community education efforts. Max has been a frequent speaker for Iowa State Bar Association Diversity and Inclusiveness Committee CLE programs like this, for which we are very grateful. Max is also a certified community health worker and a board member of the Iowa Trans Mutual Aid Fund. In their free time, Max practices as a gender and transition doula, providing free support to trans, non-binary, and gender-diverse individuals as they come out and access gender-affirming care. Although it is their life's work to fight for liberation and build community, Max is also a harpist, a powerlifter, a baker, and a spouse to Austin. Welcome and thank you, Max. Our second speaker is Breanna Young, a shareholder at the Denton Davis Brown law firm and a compassionate LGBTQ+ advocate. She serves as state chair and fellow of the American College of Trust and Estate Counsel, vice chair of the One Iowa Board of Directors, and past chair of the ISBA probate section. Breanna enjoys spending time with her rescue dog and helping clients protect and empower themselves with wills, trusts, legal name changes, confirmatory adoptions, and much, much more, as you'll hear from her today. Madison Fiedler-Carlson, I have to access this on my phone, here we go. Madison is an experienced trial attorney in Des Moines, where she practices with her partners and associates at the Fiedler Law Firm, PLC. She represents employees dealing with discrimination, harassment, retaliation, and wage and hour issues at work. She's a passionate workers' rights advocate with enormous success in helping juries and judges understand the value of emotional distress, including multiple million-dollar verdicts. Madison's CLE and teaching experience spans from the rights of transgender employees and students in public schools, to the Fair Labor Standards Act and equal pay claims, to congeniality in the legal profession, to Harry Potter in the law. I need to hear that one again. In her spare time, she loves reading and writing fantasy novels, working on home projects, and writing meticulous to-do lists. For the Chapel Roan fans out there, she is your favorite employer lawyer's favorite employer lawyer. And last but certainly not least of our speakers this afternoon, Katie Ervin Carlson. Katie graduated from law school in 2006 and began representing employees in disputes with their current or former employers. 15 years later, Katie joined a defense firm where she provided advice and counseling to employers in Iowa and nationwide on myriad workplace issues. At the beginning of this year, Katie joined Howden, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, one of the fastest growing reinsurance brokers in the US. Katie serves as chief counsel for employment, providing advice and counseling and managing litigation both for Howden and for Dual North America, Inc., which is an underwriting and claims business. In her current role, Katie works with the company's legal and human resources teams to ensure legally compliant and practical decision making. Katie is also the current chair of the Iowa State Bar Association's Labor and Employment Law section. So without further ado, we will go ahead and begin hearing from these excellent panelists, and we'll begin with you, Max. Could you please set the stage for us for today's topic and the important issues facing Iowans these days? Just provide basic definitions and descriptions so we're all on the same page.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, howdy y'all. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm always really excited to be able to work with you all, so this is just a joy. So yeah, as you can see on the screen, we're gonna have a really quick and fun Trans 101, and I hope we can keep it fun because I think right now, with all of the things that are happening in our state and nationally, I think that talking about trans issues can feel really overwhelming and scary, and I can be your friendly neighborhood trans friend and help you with some of these definitions. So I'm going to scoot through this very quickly, but if you find that you have questions or something's not obvious, feel free to always follow up. It's even though I'm the ED now, I take a lot of joy in helping folks kind of work through their experiences with trans folks to get to a place of trans support and affirmation. So with that in mind, I will go ahead and dive in. Okay, so one thing I wanted to make sure is kind of clear when we're talking about this law is that there's a difference between sexual orientation and gender identity. I think that that's probably obvious to a lot of y'all, but just in case it's not, I thought I would mention it here. So as you can see with this piece of the LGBTQ acronym, the L, the G, and the B, which stands for lesbian, gay, and bisexual, those are all sexual orientations. So a sexual orientation is a persistent pattern of sexual or romantic attraction to other people. The T, which is the community we're going to chat about, it stands for transgender. And transgender people are people that do not identify with the sex that they were assigned at birth. And we'll talk more about the community here in a moment. But I wanted to flag that the T up on the screen here is blocked out in green because it doesn't describe a sexual orientation like the ones in purple. It describes a gender identity. And gender identity is someone's internal sense of their own gender. A nice, easy way to think about this is that sexual orientation is who you go on a date with, and gender identity is who you go on a date as. So I think that that's helpful if you're trying to think through what the differences are. Now, of course, these aren't the most legal definitions, and we've got wonderful experts here, but if we're talking in our day-to-day life about trans folks, this is a really good thing to have in your back pocket. The other thing to keep in mind is that most people have a sexual orientation and gender identity, not just trans people and not just LGBTQ people. So let's talk a little bit about sex, and then we'll talk about gender identity. So sex is just a biological classification. This includes hormones, chromosomes, internal and external reproductive anatomy. Often when we're talking about sex, we're talking about what's happening in the body, whereas gender identity is how somebody identifies, like I mentioned. So we'll come back to that. But I think the important thing to consider when we talk about sex is that when we are born, we are given a sex assigned at birth. So we're born, the doctor takes a look at us, or through ultrasound imaging, takes a look at us and our biological characteristics, and often they're putting an M or an F on our birth certificate, depending on where you live. M for male and F for female. So this often, it absolutely does follow you for the rest of your life. And so when we're talking about things like gender marker changes, we're often talking about changing that M or F on a birth certificate, a driver's license, etc. So this is helpful to keep in mind because the other thing that I wanted to put up here that I think can sometimes get lost in this conversation is that someone's biological sex can change throughout the course of their lives. The average person, their biological sex characteristics are not stable and stagnant. So we can even think about this when someone gets pregnant, when someone ages, if someone has a menstrual cycle, those characteristics change and flow. They're actually pretty dynamic. But also very importantly, in the work that I do in the gender affirming care space, you can access things like gender-affirming surgeries and hormones and pretty radically shift your biological sex through just really wonderful medical interventions so that people feel more affirmed. That is a huge area of passion for me, so I won't dive into that rabbit hole, but I think that's important to keep in mind here as well. All right, I'll talk a little bit about gender identity. Like I said, gender identity is someone's own identity, so their own sense of their gender. There are a lot of different ways to have gender identities. I'll dive into some more of them here in a moment. But the thing to keep in mind here is that everyone has a gender identity in some way, shape, or form. And for a lot of folks, this does line up with the sex that they were assigned at birth. So if they were assigned female at birth and they grew up to identify as a woman, then they would be a cisgender woman. And cisgender here just means same gender, which means that that person identifies with the same gender that lines up with the sex that they were assigned at birth. Some folks get nervous about the word cisgender, but it's not a bad word, just like transgender is not a bad word. So. The other thing to keep in mind is that for most trans people, we're assigned a sex at birth and we identify as something different from that. So if you take a baby that was assigned female at birth and they grow up to identify as a man, they're probably a transgender man. So gender identity is also really interesting because gender identity does not always line up with the way that somebody looks, and the way that we perceive gender is very subjective, which is actually my next point here, which is that I think gender expression plays a really huge role in the legislation we're going to talk about today. So gender expression is the #1 way that we interact with someone based on how they look, and the number one way that most of us interact with someone else's gender, because gender expression is what we see, what we hear, what we smell when we interact with a person, which sounds weird, but bear with me. Gender expression is the way that you look, talk, dress, or act, and all of these things can combine to show your specific way that you express your gender. So think about this for yourself, because sometimes this can feel nebulous. For you, think about the ways that you dress every morning. Like this morning when you got up and got ready to leave the door or go out the door, you made a series of decisions about how you look, and that can make up your gender expression. So for example, like for me today, I'm wearing like a floral button-up shirt, I'm wearing a blazer, I've got like cute shoes that I like on, I have a short haircut, I wear makeup, but I wear cologne. These are all different things that I made an intentional decision about this morning because they help me feel like affirmed in my gender identity. This is really important because when we look at things like the bill, gender expression plays a big role in how this bill is going to be, or this legislation is going to be put into practice. But yeah, when we think about gender expression, just think about like the colors you chose to wear this morning, the way that you get your hair cut, the shoes that you wear, the cologne or perfume that you wear, the sound of the shoes that you wear, like those things all have a part to play. Even in like how bouncy is your voice? Is it a little bit more monotone? Like all these things have to do with gender expression. Clearly I'm passionate about this, but this is really important because again, this law interacts with gender expression a lot because like this can impact transgender people, but also people that are perceived to be transgender. And so I think that's an important piece because a lot of the way that the average person is going to interact with someone is based on like a 10-second analysis of what that person thinks that person's gender is, right? So when we meet people, our brain is really good at condensing down big pieces of information so that we can move through the world without glitching, basically. And one of the pieces of information our brain loves to condense down is the gender of a person in front of us, amongst many other things. So I think that's important because things like this legislation also really impact people that are not part of the trans community. They might be lesbian or gay, or they could be straight and cisgender allies that just express their gender a certain way. So, and very important piece of that. So as I'm coming down to my last minute or so, I wanted to just give you all a final primer on what it means when we talk about transgender people and non-binary people. So as you can see, I have two very cute umbrellas up on the screen. So this includes the transgender umbrella, which again is anyone that doesn't identify with the sex that they were assigned at birth, but this is a really large community. We're very diverse. So on the one side over here, you see binary trans folks. So in the United States in 2025, we have a pretty well ingrained sense of a gender binary. And in fact, many of the people that are in positions of power right now really firmly believe that those are the two genders that are available to people. That's a conversation for a different time. However, if you when we're talking about binary trans folks, we are talking about people that identify as men or women. So trans women are women and trans men are men. When somebody says, hi, I'm a trans woman, they're telling you, I identify as a woman. So it's not going to be particularly relevant to know the sex that they were assigned at birth or if they've accessed gender affirming care. All you need to know on a day-to-day basis is their identity, which is trans women are women, trans men are men. I've often joked that if I got a forehead tattoo, it would be that. maybe later in my life I will do that. So it's very clear. Sometimes folks want to do some backwards math, or they wonder, oh, is a trans woman a person that was assigned female at birth? Like I get that it can be confusing, but the answer is right there in that person's identity. It's right there for you. So don't worry so much. And then as I round things out, the last thing I'll mention is the non-binary community. So in the same way that we have binary folks that identify as men and women, because that's the gender binary in our country in this moment, there are also people that don't identify as men and women, and those people are so cool. And so non-binary people are also impacted by this, and non-binary people are just people that don't identify as men or women. And as you can see on the screen, there are a myriad of identities under this umbrella. Actually, there are dozens more that I couldn't even fit on a screen like this. So again, if you're ever curious and more information on that, please let me know. But the last thing I'll note here is that you can see that the non-binary umbrella is partially in and partially out of the trans umbrella, because there are a lot of non-binary people that don't identify as trans or transgender, and that's totally fine. So just thought I'd mention that nuance there. And with that, I have spoken as much as I can, but if you, again, have questions or some of this is confusing to you, please feel free to reach out. It's my favorite thing to talk about, and I'll move it on along.
Thank you so much, Max. And I guess I know from personal experience that, yes, you are always willing to provide this excellent education to lawyers and to other groups. So thank you very much. Now, Madison, moving on. The official title of our program today is Now What? What can lawyers do to advocate for their clients in light of Senate File 418, which becomes effective July 1st of this year. Can you, and I guess I'll add one other note, that Diversity and Inclusiveness Committee of the Iowa State Bar Association actually celebrated the 60th, preemptively celebrated the 60th anniversary of the Iowa Civil Rights Act. So can you tell us the details of the changes that Senate File 418 makes to this 60-year-old Iowa Civil Rights Act?
Yes. So there's two kind of big changes that affect the entire Iowa Code, first and foremost. So the first big change is that the definitions of sex as male or female are defined. And so the biological differences are really the focus now of that definition, specifically around the reproduction or the ability or lack thereof to reproduce. The other big change that applies to the entire Iowa Code is the codification of separate but equal language. So there is language now that says specifically the term equal does not mean the same or identical, and that separate accommodations are not inherently unequal. So for those of us familiar with Brown v. Board of Education, we might have some questions there. The other big change before we get to the protected class issue is under birth certificates. So the code used to allow for notarized affidavits by a doctor stating that by reason of surgery or treatment, this person's sex designation is changed. That's gone now. Instead, even now on new updated birth certificates, it's required to state the sex assigned at birth. And yeah, the big reason under the ICRA that we're here is that gender identity is no longer a protected class under the Iowa Civil Rights Act. So that applies to a bunch of different areas under Iowa law. That applies to employment, to housing, to credit, and also to education. This means that all prohibited discriminatory practices no longer cover gender identity under Iowa law. So for employment, the way we usually see those kind of practices are like hiring, firing, employment decisions like promotions, terminations, even equal pay. And this does affect both sides, right? So this would, at least in theory, allow an employer to pay a trans person more than a cis person for performing the exact same job under the exact same circumstances. In housing, this would cover things like renting, choosing to rent or not rent to a trans person, lease agreements, subleasing, accommodations, advertising, prospective renting, real estate transactions. And for credit, we see this in, entering into unfair credit transactions. It could potentially be legal now to raise charges for trans people, but not for cis people, offering credit in the first place. We also see this in education. The big change to the statute now is that all references to gender identity under the education portion of the statute are now changed to gender theory. So that's the biggest difference with the education section, is it kind of changes it from this like thing that we know exists, like gender identity, to like just like a theory under education. The other two big differences is that the statute has kind of two different carve-outs under kind of the set rules that they changed. So the one carve out is that the beginning states that essentially if someone is diagnosed with like gender dysphoria or some kind of disability relating to their gender identity, that they don't lose protections under federal law, like the Americans with Disabilities Act. This of course assumes that every trans person who's getting discriminated against has that diagnosis, that these individuals are also going to be able to get to the doctor, given that they are no longer entitled to housing or credit or work, and that their doctor can and will diagnose them with a disability like that. And also, not all diagnoses are disabilities under the law. So under employment law, a plaintiff has to prove that a condition that they have affects a major life activity or bodily function. So that's still something that we would have to deal with under disability law. And the last kind of little piece here is that they try to carve out an exception, basically saying, well, we don't intend for any of this to allow discrimination against cis women. So we don't want any of the separate but equal language to apply to biological women. That we're not really worried about that. You can't treat biological women differently. So there's that carve out under the statute too.
Thank you, Madison. I should have said this at the beginning, but I'll say it now. If any of you in the attendees have questions about anything that you've heard thus far or that you hear during the rest of the hour, please feel free to go ahead and put those in the questions section of the GoToWebinar function. I guess I'll intersperse a question you might not be expecting, Madison, but I'm sure you can speak to this. So one more term that's been mentioned that is very different, and that term is gender norms. Basically, the term that was used way back when in the Price Waterhouse case. So if you can describe the difference between gender identity, gender expression, as Max just clearly defined, and gender norms.
So I love this question. This is like my topic that I'm like, I could talk about all day. So like you mentioned, so Price Waterhouse was a case out of 1989, out of the United States Supreme Court. And that case really established that not conforming to social or kind of societal expectations of gender is sex discrimination. It is gender discrimination. So in Price Waterhouse, that was a situation where it was a cis woman who just kind of acted a little bit more butch. She was really good at her job, but she was seen as aggressive, as unladylike, They asked if she could wear more makeup and do her hair better, wear jewelry, things like that. And so the United States Supreme Court back in 1989 determined that that was an impermissible view of sex, to say that, okay, I think women should look and act like this. And so having those kind of impermissible views of gender norms and what we call sex stereotyping was illegal under sex discrimination. And I think what's important here with those gender norms, like Max was saying, is that, trans people are facing discrimination on the same basis that cis people are, and that, that they're not conforming to expectations about what a woman looks like or what a man looks like. These are all the same kind of impermissible sex stereotyping and gender norms that hurt cis people the same exact way that they hurt trans people. And so we kind of see that gender expression issue come back in Bostock, which is a 2020 case out of the United States Supreme Court, which found that discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity is still sex discrimination. And this is unlikely to change. That's one of the good news parts of this, is that the 2020 United States Supreme Court is almost all the same people as currently sits on the Supreme Court. They're very unlikely to overturn themselves in the same way that if the court had changed a lot since, they would overturn themselves. The hard part under Iowa law is that the Iowa Supreme Court has historically not interpreted sex discrimination the same way. So the Iowa Supreme Court back in 1983, it's the Summers versus Iowa Civil Rights Commission case. That was a situation where they rejected an argument that the term sex or sex discrimination opened the door for gender identity. And so the court determined that the Iowa Civil Rights Act the purpose was to forbid discrimination against women based on being equal to men in the workplace. And so it did not forbid discrimination against trans people. And in Roe v. State, which was in 2021, the court, this was after the Bostock decision came out, which is really the important part, where that United States Supreme Court said, no sexual orientation and gender identity is sex discrimination. The Iowa Supreme Court disagreed. And they said, at least with Iowa, under the Iowa Civil Rights Act, we've specifically had gender identity as a separate class. And if the legislature meant it to go under sex, they would have amended the definition of sex. They wouldn't have added gender identity. And so they determined that words mean something, and that the Iowa legislature didn't intend for sex to cover gender identity. So we can't really use the same forms of protection under state law that historically we have under federal law, based on these kind of sex stereotyping gender expression issues.
So what other protections are still in effect, mostly under federal, maybe the 14th Amendment, so other, Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court cases and other federal law, like where, what can people, that's another part of now what can people do now, what protections might still be in place?
Yeah, so there certainly are federal laws that are going to still protect trans people. You had mentioned equal protection. I actually had my first equal protection case this last 2 years or so. So that's under the 14th Amendment, and essentially that protects people from state actions. So that's not going to protect anybody from private employers treating you differently or anything like that. This is if the state government or a government entity is treating you differently because of your gender identity. So that prohibits state actions that discriminate against individuals or groups with protected characteristics. This is not as cut and dry about whether it will protect gender identity as, let's say, the ICRA did when it had gender identity as a class, because the 14th Amendment doesn't necessarily list out every protected class that's applicable. It's really based on court interpretation of what that means. And as we know, that can change over time. So under employment, at least, we also have Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. So that applies to both state and private employers, and that specifically does protect gender identity under BOSTIC. So the actual language of Title VII doesn't include the language gender identity as a protected class, but the United States Supreme Court has determined that it counts under sex. The hard part is that, so the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission is kind of the organization that interprets Title VII for the government, and they have previously interpreted it to include prohibitions against sexual orientation and gender identity. But the new director has taken steps to roll that back since, so the guidance is very likely going to change as it moves forward. And then with housing, the Fair Housing Act is federal. That also prohibits discrimination based on sex. And HUD, which is the Housing and Urban Development Office, also, again, like the EEOC provides guidance, historically has been interpreted to protect trans people. There's a new director who has halted enforcement of that. And then with credit, there's the Equal Credit Opportunity Act that, once again, prohibits discrimination on sex. And the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau offers guidance for the same thing, that sex covers gender identity. I haven't seen any statements from the new director yet, so I don't know what's going to happen there, but I wouldn't be shocked if they followed suit. And then for education, we have Title IX that also protects discrimination on sex in education, including gender identity. The Department of Education has previously determined that sex includes gender identity, but we'll see if the DOE survives to make any statements about that moving forward.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Madison. Now, moving on, Breanna. So what can we do, Iowa lawyers, do now? And what suggestions do you have for transgender clients and colleagues that all of the attendees may be dealing with now or in the next few weeks, few months?
Yeah, in a way, this is all new territory because this Jim Crow style separate but equal law is the first time that a state has ever removed a protected class from its Civil Rights Act. So again, it's novel territory for all of us, but there are some things that we do know for certain. So first of all, we know the July 1st effective date, and we know what changes on that date. So apart from the removal of protections, civil rights protections for transgender and non-binary Iowans and those perceived to potentially be transgender or non-binary, there's also the removal of the ability to correct a sex designation on an Iowa birth certificate. So it matters not where you live today. If you were born in Iowa, your birth certificate will say Iowa at the top. And if that is the case, then starting July 1st, you'll no longer be able to correct the sex designation from M to F or F to M, as you currently are able to do. So that's one thing that does change. Something that does not change, though, is that you can still legally change your name in Iowa. And you can also change your name on your birth certificate once you've gotten a legal name change in Iowa. So, and I don't anticipate that ability will ever go away because that's something that affects transgender people, but also cisgender people. And also it's widely applicable. So not targeting transgender people. So I expect it'll remain in effect. So steps that can be taken would be to consider for clients who do need to correct their sex designations on Iowa birth certificates, consider getting those changes in just absolutely as quickly as you possibly can. There is a process to follow, and it is not the case that the documents need to be submitted by July 1st to Iowa Department of Health and Human Services. It's that they must be processed by July 1st. So it's very, very important that we as attorneys help our clients get it right the first time and expedite the documents. There is a very, very helpful, just incredibly helpful guide that Professor Len Sandler, University of Iowa College of Law, and his Law and Policy in Action and Estate Planning Clinic put in in place. I'm looking at it right now. It's the Iowa Guide to Changing Legal Identity Documents. This was done while it was still possible to correct federal documents like passports. That's no longer the case. So, but the Iowa portions of this guide are just wonderful. And this is a guide that's available online. If you look up University of Iowa Guide to Changing Legal Identity Documents, or just email me, I can give it to you. It's just wonderful. It's very user friendly. It's public facing. And so it's designed to help somebody without a lawyer, or if you are a lawyer, help you walk through step by step the process of doing that birth certificate correction. Earlier this month, I think it was, earlier this month, my firm, Dentons, Davis Brown, did a free LGBTQ legal clinic with Drake Legal Clinic. Professor Nicole Miller there, who is just absolutely wonderful, and her clinical law students at Drake. And we helped lots of folks with sex designation corrections on their Iowa birth certificates, and we have gotten some bounce backs from Iowa Department of Health and Human Services. The most common rejection reason is that you have to provide a form, a certain Iowa Department of Health and Human Services form, and a copy of your ID. But the most common reason for the bounce back is that the other document that you have to provide, an affidavit from a physician, doesn't include all of the necessary information. We have found that the Department of Vital Records has been much more, I guess, I don't want to say, I guess, lenient in the past about the affidavits, but it has been the case recently that affidavit must include each and every piece of information that's required by law, or potentially required by law, in order to work and be accepted. And so in the guide that I just referenced, there is a sample affidavit there, and I recommend considering having the healthcare provider follow it to a T. It must be signed, it must be notarized. The person signing must be a doctor, so it has to be a physician, surgeon, so it cannot be a PA, for example, and it must include certain information. So if you follow the sample affidavit in the guide, I think it's on like page 36 or 39. 39, there we go. I use this guide a lot, it's awesome. You can't go wrong. So again, helping clients get those documents in as quickly as possible if they do need to do a correction. We've also been seeing some rejections from Vital Records for sex designation corrections for minor children. And the letter that we received back says that it's because something along the lines of gender affirming care for minors is not lawful in Iowa, something like that, but that is not the case. It is perfectly legal for a child in Iowa to receive gender affirming care, including medical care. It is perfectly legal for their parents to help foster that care. What is not legal is for an Iowa healthcare provider to provide that care. We have provided to Vital Records affidavits from other states where gender affirming care for minors is still legal. For example, Minnesota. And we've still gotten bounce backs from Vital Records saying that gender affirming care is not lawful, which of course is not the case. And time is very much of the essence because that July 1st deadline looms large. I believe that there's been some potential headway made with Vital Records, but I would encourage anybody who's experienced anything like that, if your client is willing to share, to have you reach out to me, or Professor Nicole Miller at Drake has graciously offered to have me provide her email address, and that email address is nicole.miller@drake.edu. and Nicole has a K in it, so it's nickole.miller@drake.edu, and she works for the Children's Law Clinic. So if it's anything pertaining to a minor, that's one way to help as well.
Thank you. A couple questions came in that I believe you can answer, Breanna. One is the X marker allowed on Iowa birth certificates?
The X marker is not allowed on Iowa birth certificates. There was a situation where it was permitted for a very brief moment in time on an Iowa driver's license, but that did not come to a good end. So no, it is not permitted. It used to be the case previously, pre-January 2025, that X gender markers were permitted on U.S. passports and U.S. consular reports of birth abroad, kind of like international birth certificates. So on those two federal documents, you could have an M, you could have an X, you could have an F. Those are no longer permitted as of January 20, 2025 because of an executive order signed by Trump, and then 2 days later, direction by Secretary of State Marco Rubio to stop permitting those changes to be made.
Okay, and then another question related to the physicians who must sign those affidavits and maybe Max might have this as well. Is there a list of trans-friendly physicians statewide who the attendees, Iowa lawyers, can refer clients to for the birth certificate affidavit? Does such a list exist?
Yes, yes, so passionate about this personally. So yes, on the One Iowa website, we have a pretty robust health and wellness resource guide. Also, if you have a client that needs to access like mental health care, for example. So that's going to be a really helpful guide. But if, for example, you're a little bit anxious about it and you want some more support helping them find someone, please feel free to reach out to our team directly. I can often kind of talk people through what the experience of a current provider is. And we have a very good trusted list of folks that when we're having this conversation, they know what we're talking about. You don't have to start from scratch with a provider that's never worked with a trans person before. So please reach out to us. Our website is oneiowa.org, so oneiowa.org, and it's in the resource guide section, but reach out as well.
Thank you. And then here's one more question for you, probably, Breanna. What do you recommend with regards to advising name change clients about the potential risks of having a passport that won't match their birth certificate or other state level documents like their driver's license or state issued ID?
There's really good information available at transequality.org. And one of the FAQs on that website is it a problem to have mismatched gender markers on different documents or names on different documents? And I'm part of the LGBTQ+ Bar Association as well. And so we have a very active listserv. As you can imagine, there's no shortage of things about which to talk. And the consensus here and on the listserv is that yes, when you travel, especially with name changes, there are all kinds of reasons that people could change their names, right? They get married, they get divorced, who knows, right? But just bring something along with you that documents your name change. So if your name that you bought your airline tickets under, for example, doesn't match that on your passport, just bring a copy of the decree of name change. I will say there's a degree of risk, not so much with the name change, but certainly with the sex designation correction. And I forgot to mention this earlier, but we've had a lot of clients who are very, very concerned about doing the sex designation correction on their Iowa birth certificates, and is it safe? And because it's necessary in order to get that correction to provide an affidavit to the state of Iowa showing that you are a person who has had gender affirming care, or this minor child has had gender affirming care, I think that there is some degree of risk there. Again, not unlawful for parents to arrange for that care for their children at all. right? It's it's the standard of care. It's medically necessary care, and parents want what's best for our kids. But I do think that that's a concern that we've been hearing a lot, and I think that we're doing our clients a disservice if we don't at least say, hey, just so you're aware, the state will have a record of the types of gender affirming care that you've had if you choose to change your sex designation on your birth certificate.
Thank you so much, Breanna. I think we need to move on. Katie, thank you for patiently waiting while the other speakers speak. As in-house counsel, and especially as in-house counsel for a company with employees in many different states, including Iowa, what do you suggest that other in-house counsel or other attorneys advising employers do now, between now and July 1st and then after July 1st?
Sure. So I think my advice or my suggestion for before July 1st and after July 1st is really the same. I've been in-house since January of last year, so I've got a little bit of experience under my belt in terms of sort of what in-house practitioners might be looking at, as well as those of you who advise companies, even if you're not necessarily an employment lawyer. I think on this issue, probably the most important thing to remember is that the law is a floor, not a ceiling. And so just because the Iowa legislature has said trans individuals cannot sue under the Iowa Civil Rights Act for employment discrimination, for example, that doesn't mean that employers should start allowing discrimination against trans employees. There's no reason that an employer could not say, you know what, that's what the Iowa law is, but we as a company want to serve a different, want to send a different message to our employee population. We want to have a different culture. And so we are going to include that as a protected policy, for example, protected class, for example, in handbooks. The company, I support two companies. There are a whopping 2 Iowa employees in the entire company, myself being one of them. So I really focus on other states, and that's something that I think we need to be aware of as well. I think pre-pandemic days, there were a lot of people who were exclusively Iowa employment lawyers, or they advised exclusively Iowa employers. Once we became more remote, I think that has become less common, or at least it's become more common that we are advising employers and companies who have employees all over the place. And so it's very likely that you may be advising a client who has employees in states where transgender is still, or gender identity is still a protected class under that state's Civil Rights Act. And so it's important to be mindful of that while it may not be protected in Iowa, it could be protected elsewhere, just like Madison was saying with some of the federal protections. And so you're really in a position of, okay, are we going to create 2 separate classes of employees where if you live in a state where gender identity is protected, then we'll protect you under our policies, and if you don't, then we won't? Or are you just going to have sort of a uniform set of policies that says, you know, as a principle, we're going to protect all of our employees the same, regardless of what state you're working in, and therefore we're going to have this one set of EEO policies that applies to everyone. So I would advise people not to just jump and have sort of a knee-jerk reaction and say, well, it's not in the Iowa Civil Rights Act anymore, so we're taking it out of the handbook, we're taking it out of our policies. Because for one, that's not going to be true of employees in other states, and number 2, it may not be the right thing to do. It may not be the culture that you want to maintain as a company. I would say the same thing in terms of training. So some states, for example, California, will require us to train employees as part of sexual harassment training on things like gender identity, transgender rights. That's obviously not something that's required in the state of Iowa for Iowa specific employers, although I don't think it's a bad thing. And so I think considering providing training to employees to provide a more inclusive and supportive workplace is a really important consideration for employers, regardless of what the state law says. Obviously, Max at One Iowa does a fantastic job. When I was practicing at the Timmer and Judkins law firm. We underwent Max's training back in the old days before you were executive director. And it was great, and it was super informative, and it was just a really helpful thing for us in our practice. In my current life, doing employee handbooks and employee training for employees across the country, I've also come across, it's actually a theater company in New York called the Honest Accomplice Theater. They have a transliteracy project, and they've got sort of these little snippets on YouTube that I was able to embed in some of our sexual harassment training. Super helpful, kind of easy way to explain some of these concepts to employees. If employers are nervous about saying, well, but the law doesn't protect these employees, so how do we navigate that? You can just be educating your workforce, because we all want to have workplaces that are inclusive and safe and comfortable for all employees, and part of that is education. So I don't even think you have to go so far as to talk about legal protections. It's more, this is who we are as a company. So I would say that just because someone may not be able to sue you for not protecting them under Iowa law, that doesn't mean you shouldn't still engage in any number of things on a policy, on a handbook, on training, to support transgender employees. My one caveat to that is that if you're a federal contractor, or you're representing federal contractors or advising them, if you're advising or representing educational institutions, got all these executive orders that are really kind of throwing a wrench in things. So I do think you have to be sort of careful when you're not just sort of a run-of-the-mill private employer. I think private employers have a little bit more leeway to sort of do what they want to do under some of these laws and policies. But that would be the one thing. When I say there's no reason not to, of course, some of these executive orders do give employers pause. That said, I think it's still worth taking a really thoughtful look at how can we show support for trans employees and still feel comfortable that we're operating under the law.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have had a number of questions, so some of them I've asked you already, and thanks to those of you who've already answered them. There's a couple more. They're not necessarily related, so I'll just open up to, I'm guessing this first one, Madison, Katie, you might be able to answer that. Any thoughts on impacts on HIPAA? And then also this person heard that there's a move to dismantle HIPAA, and I'm guessing really the privacy part of HIPAA. Any thoughts on this? Anything you've heard about this?
I haven't heard anything about HIPAA.
I have not either.
Okay, well
And I believe that would take an act of Congress, right? Since it's a federal law.
Yes.
So yeah, I haven't heard anything. I don't know, Max or Breanna.
Okay, well, thank you to the questioner. You've given us an idea for another program for a future CLE program.
I know.
Yeah, as if everyone needed anything else to worry about. And then another interesting, speaking of constitutional amendments, the ERA has been languishing for quite a while. Thoughts on whether or not the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, to the U.S. Constitution would provide protection for gender identity as it would for sex, as some of the definitions we've already heard in some of the Supreme Court cases, equating sex discrimination with gender identity discrimination. So I don't know. Thoughts on that?
I would assume it probably it depends on how they define sex in it. If it's just the definition of sex we've kind of been working with, I would assume that federal law would continue to be interpreted the same way, and therefore cover gender identity. But I also could see a lot of people in power not liking that, and so I would not be shocked if either obviously it didn't pass or they changed definitions internally,
or did a carve out, like you said,
right?
For the Iowa law.
Okay, well, thank you. Yeah, great questions to the attendees. Thank you very much. Another is, and I don't know if you'd be able to answer this or not, but your views on, well, has there been any challenges yet to Senate File 418, and or will there be any legal challenges to it? And sorry, I'm trying to read the small print on this question. And do we have any thoughts about what avenues are available to challenge it, you know, and whether they'll be successful? So really long question, but thoughts on that topic of thinking, you know, speaking of now, what are people doing now or between now and July 1st, or plans for legal challenges after July 1st? Thoughts from any of you on that question?
I'm a probate lawyer, but I don't litigate, but I know that there are some individuals who are looking to launch a challenge against specific portions of the law as being unconstitutional.
I don't know any specifics, but the separate but equal language is that really stood out to me as a pretty clear challengeable issue.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. The section, I presume you're speaking to the Iowa Code, section 4.1.
Yep.
Separate is accommodations are not inherently unequal.
Yes, which is basically word for word the opposite of what Brown v. Board of Education said.
Yes,
so I wouldn't be shocked if there was a challenge to that, but I haven't heard about any yet.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And I think we've now covered all of the questions. But again, yeah, thanks to all of you who have asked questions from the audience. I'll now give each of you, you know, a minute or so closing thoughts on Senate File 418, on its impacts, and or again, what can people do now? What can they do now for the next few months before it becomes effective? So go ahead and start with you, Madison.
Sure. So I would say first and foremost, when people come into your office, you know, I would say check statute of limitations, check what's available to file before it goes into effect. And also ask what people need. I am like that annoying person who goes into like stores and I'm like, are you being paid correctly? And so, you know, if you have a client who you think might need a name change, you might as well just offer, like, there are things that, you know, people can provide, and refer things out if it's not something you can do. The other thing is just get creative. You know, I learned how to do name changes in about an hour. It was not difficult to do. It has brought me immense joy to do them. And I love doing them. I usually have at least one. And I think the last thing I just really want to emphasize is that, you know, this does affect every single person in Iowa. That, you know, when any of our rights are on the line, it affects every single person. And, you know, if our rights depend on who's in power, those aren't rights any longer, they're privileges. And so I think we all really need to, you know, do what we can to help each other and use our privileges and skills to help our community.
Thank you. Katie, final thoughts?
Yeah, I would say for in-house lawyers where your client is also your employer, for private practice attorneys who have business clients, I would really encourage them to do more than what the Iowa law requires. I think that it's the right thing to do to protect trans employees. It was the right thing to include gender identity when it was included in the Iowa Civil Rights Act. It's still the right thing to do from an employment policy and training perspective. And so that would be my advice, is to really push your clients to consider doing that as opposed to stripping rights away.
Thank you. Breanna, your final thoughts?
Yeah, I represent lots and lots of LGBTQ plus clients, and when they come into my office, we talk about how, you know, there are two ways that you can get legal rights. You can get legal rights because the federal government gives you rights, or state government gives you rights, right? Or you can get legal rights by signing contracts, and it's that second thing that we can do something about quite easily, right? So getting the wills in place, powers of attorneys, trust agreements, healthcare directives, getting them in place and making sure that they include some really strong, robust language, making sure that the language that we use in those documents isn't necessarily the same as just the language we would use for non-LGBTQ clients, because there are specific legal issues impacting those communities. I think that as lawyers, we're really, really uniquely situated to be able to help folks in a really in a way that other people cannot. And so it's a privilege to be able to do that. And that is all. Thank you.
Thank you. Max, final thought.
Yeah. I guess what I'll say, I'm not a lawyer, so I want to speak to you all in two ways. First, if you are an LGBTQ person, if you're a trans or non-binary person, I want you to know that there are a lot of folks that are going to stay here in Iowa that are going to continue to fight for you, and that you're truly not alone. I think it's really important that when we talk about legislation and laws like this, we underscore the fact that they want us to feel isolated and they want us to feel like there's not a place for us in Iowa. And I truly believe that just like in 2007, when this became a part of the Civil Rights Code, like there are a lot of people that love LGBTQ people in Iowa. And it's a profound privilege of my job that in addition to seeing all the crappy stuff that happens, I also see all the people that know that this isn't right and are stepping up. So there's that. And then I think if you are somebody that is supporting LGBTQ folks, please let them know about resources and ways to connect. I love it when people reach out and say, like, I'm feeling really lonely. How can I get connected? That's like a really beautiful part of the work I do as well. And so please have them connect with our team. We want to make sure that they can head to a local clothing pop-up or go to their local Pride or be engaged, because when you see other people, I think about the Trans Lives Festival that just happened here in Des Moines a couple days ago, and just walking up to the building like lowered my blood pressure. So I really think that even though you're representing folks, providing some of that more like day-to-day support and getting folks connected is really important. And of course, like this is one of those moments where we need cisgender folks, we need allies to the community. We need those folks to do things that are brave and courageous. So of course there's things with the law. I am not the law expert here. There's a word for that. It's lawyer. I'm so sorry. Law expert, geez. But what I will say is that if you're like an employer, if you have any space that you have a place of leadership in, just preemptive compliance, doing things that are incredibly risk averse, pushing trans folks out of the conversation preemptively so you can, feel a little bit more secure is really, it's not the courageous thing to do. I know that there's limitations on that. This is a moment when we need to step up for the people that are most marginalized, period, end of subject. So that's trans people, that's undocumented people, that's folks of color. And this is not the time to be throwing those folks under the bus. So, be bold, reach out if you need support in being bold, but that's the last thing that I'll say. I'm going to guess a lot of the people that are on this webinar today have positions of power and ways to wield those to support marginalized folks. So yeah, and thanks for being here as well. This is a big deal. So
thank you. Thank you all so much for sharing your wisdom and experience and expertise with all of our attendees.